Hey guys, my name's Charlie Wakley. I'm a Scientologist, and today we're going to be talking about answers to drugs. So first of all, just so I'm totally transparent with the audience here, I've never personally taken what would classify as street drugs. So I've dabbled in alcohol and cigarettes and such before, but I just want to be totally open and honest that I've never gone through a drug problem myself. But I hope that my work with people that have gone through a drug problem and in drug rehabilitation and drug education gives me some authority to be able to talk on this subject. I actually do have a couple of great guest speakers lined up who have had more experience on this subject than me, but I just want to give you a few snippets from this chapter that I think you might find useful. And the reason I wanted to talk to you really is just because although I haven't gone through it myself, this is something I'm super passionate about, both in drug education and the prevention of people taking drugs, but also in drug rehab. I've worked with a lot of people that have had various drug problems, and the facilities out there for drug rehab are really quite limited. And the biggest problem that I've seen is that most, if not all, of the conventional kind of drug rehab centers use what's called replacement drugs. So if someone's coming off heroin, they'll be told to take methadone, I think it is. And that drug, actually, we have a harder time getting people off of that drug than the heroin itself. So this concept of replacement drugs or medicating the drug problem is something I feel really passionate about. And I've worked with organizations such as Narconon that provide a really good drug rehab service. And I know that, you know, not just the person themselves going through it, but the friends and particularly the family members around them, it can be really, really tough. So this is something I feel super passionate about, and I hope some of this information is useful. I hope you don't find it, you know, patronizing me talking about it because I haven't gone through it myself. But again, maybe you can do this from the viewpoint of if you yourself are not going through this, maybe you know someone that is, and from that perspective, you'll find this information useful. So there's a few bits here that I just think are interesting kind of views of L. Ron Hubbard, and a few bits that I think you'll find quite useful. So again, we're talking about answers to drugs. This is from the Scientology Handbook by L. Ron Hubbard, and I'm going to read you a few snippets. Okay, so this is the intro, and the first article here is called "The Reason Behind the Drug Problem." And he goes on to say here, people have used drugs for as long as they have tried to ease pain and avoid problems. Since the 1960s, however, drugs have been in very widespread use. Before that time, they were rare. A worldwide spread of drugs occurred during that decade, and a large percentage of people became drug takers. Now, it's interesting. Again, I never really thought of it like that because, at least since I've been alive, drugs have been quite prevalent. And although I've seen, I would say, an increase in drug use, particularly in some categories like weed and maybe like drugs like antidepressants, like medical drugs, have increased, but they've always been around. It's interesting that he says here that before the 1960s, they were very rare. Now it's almost the opposite. Between painkillers, things in the category of antidepressants and street drugs, they're everywhere. So interesting first point there. Then he goes on to say, yet, though the dangers and liabilities of drugs are blatantly obvious and increasingly well documented, people continue to take them. Why? When a person is depressed or in pain, and where he finds no physical relief from treatment, he will eventually discover for himself that drugs remove his symptoms. Now, that's like, to me, the most clear and basic and simple way of describing it. When a person is depressed, so you could say that that's kind of a mental anguish, or in pain, as in physical pain, and you don't find any treatment for the cause of that thing, if you find that drugs will relieve that, you'll take them. Now, a very simple example, if you've got a toothache, if you cannot get immediately to the root cause of that toothache, you'll take painkillers. This is something I can speak on from a personal example. Up all night with agonizing toothache, 4 a.m. in the morning, you're gonna probably pop a painkiller. Now, here's the important bit, and I've done it wrong and right. If you don't try to get to the cause of that toothache in the near future, let's say in the next 24, 48 hours, you're going to have to rely on those painkillers to sleep, to to operate at all, you know, to sleep, to go to work, to be able to speak to people, to really do anything, you're going to then rely on those painkillers. But the right thing to do would be to go to the dentist the next day, emergency appointment, find out what's wrong, get whatever it is you need to get. I remember for me it was I had to get a root canal, and the first time I had it, I couldn't face going to the dentist and getting that root canal. It was like, that to me was more painful than the concept of just like trying to cope through it and maybe take a painkiller here and there if I had to. But I learned the hard way that really you want to get, as soon as you can, get to the root of the problem. If you have to use the painkiller, use it when you have to, but then make sure you get to the root cause. And I think it's the same thing that he's talking about here. Then he goes on to say, when he at last finds that only drugs give him relief, he will surrender to them and become dependent upon them, often to the point of addiction. Now again, I know this is a very limited example, but if I never did something about my toothache, I would have been taking painkillers every day to be able to operate. Just as someone who is, you know, again, I want to make it clear, this is my personal opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Church of Scientology, but if someone was depressed, they could take antidepressants, and it wouldn't get to the root cause. Same reason as, you know, if you're looking for more in life, maybe you take drugs to kind of explore what's more in life, but then that's not the root cause either. So the key thing here is, when he at last finds that only drugs give him relief, he will surrender to them and become dependent upon them, often to the point of addiction. Then he goes on to explain drugs' effect on the mind and defines really what drugs are and what they're doing. So here he says drugs are essentially poisons. The degree that they are taken determines the effect. A small amount gives a stimulant, increased activity. A greater amount acts as a sedative, suppresses activity. A larger amount acts as a poison and can kill one. This is true of any drug. Each requires a different amount. So for example, caffeine is a drug. So coffee is an example. 100 cups of coffee would probably kill a person. 10 cups would probably put him to sleep. 2 or 3 cups stimulates. This is a very common drug. It is not very harmful as it takes so much of it to have an effect. So it is known as a stimulant. But he's saying that all drugs follow the same pattern. So what do you have? You have first a stimulant, then a depressant, suppresses activity, and eventually, with what you might call the OD or overdose, it can kill a person. So those are the kind of effects of a drug. Then he goes on here. So again, I mentioned this a little bit before, but here it is again. The person had this problem then. He's talking about helping someone get off drugs here. Now, again, just to give you a personal experience, when I've worked with people from anything from alcohol to weed to harder drugs, the hardest thing is the withdrawal period. So very often I find people instinctively know that the drug, they don't want to be taking the drug. They don't want to be reliant on this drug. But in a lot of cases, they've almost lost hope of the fact that they'll be able to come off it. And I find that hardest period to work with a person is probably the first 24, 48 hours, but really the week where you're withdrawing them from the drug. And so he talks about this here, and in the rest of this book, if you really want to learn about this subject, you should do this course. If you know someone who is on drugs or alcohol, you can use just what's in this book and you'll be able to help them. So it's on Scientology.org/courses, just like all the other ones, and I'll leave the link in the description. So he's talking about withdrawal here and the withdrawal symptoms that set in. And then he says the person had this problem. A, stay on drugs and be trapped and suffering from here on out. Or B, try to come off the drugs and be so agonizingly ill, meanwhile, that he couldn't stand it. So again, if someone's been taking, let's say they've been drinking for 10 years to, just numb the pain of life or existence, whether that was because of a family breakup or losing their job, it could have been many, many things. But let's say they're just drinking for 10 years to numb the pain. When offered coming off the drugs, whether it's by them or someone close to them, they have these two problems. Do you stay on the drugs and be trapped and suffering from here on out? Or do you try to come off the drugs and be so agonizingly ill meanwhile that you couldn't stand it? He says here, this is a dead if you do, dead if you don't sort of problem. So he goes on in this chapter explaining some nutritional information and also some very, very simple light kind of procedures that you can do with a person. It takes two people, so you'll need to be there to help the person, but it gives you some really, really good practical advice here about what you can do to help someone who is coming off any kind of drugs or alcohol. So yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. This is going to be quite a short talk. This is something I'm super passionate about. There's a few different things you can check out if you're interested in this. Narcan is a full drug rehab program. There's also a campaign called The Truth About Drugs, which is basically like a drug educational program which works more on the preventative side. And actually I've got a guest speaker in the next week that's going to be talking more about that. But I hope you find this useful, and really all I would say at this point is I'd encourage you to look at the information online, do the free course if this is something you're really passionate about, and I'll end with this little bit. Hubbard says here, without workable methods to handle the effects of drugs, many people are doomed to live in chemical shackles. While drugs may appear to have short-term benefits, they only mask problems, they don't solve them. So if you or anyone you know has this problem, please use this information, help them personally, or get this information to someone that can help them. Thank you very much for watching. I think we're just 2 episodes out from having finished this series, and then there'll be more stuff coming from us, these intro lectures. If you want to do the course, again, I'll leave the website in the description. Check out Scientology TV and subscribe to the channel. Thanks, guys.